Hello, and welcome to Social Evolution. I'm your host, Michael Porcelli.
And I'm Max Borders.
And we're here to talk about the future of humanity. And today we're specifically going to be focusing on human psychosocial development.
Human psychosocial development. It's quite a mouthful.
Sure.
But it really is right at the center of who we are as human beings. And it's really hard to get your head around sometimes. A lot of people have tried.
Yeah, totally. So, there's one thing, which is biological evolution, which is this brilliant theory that Darwin really solidified, and it relates, species to each other. And with the discovery of DNA, we sort of realize we're all part of one family of life here. In some sense, we're all just distant relatives of each other, every species on Earth, every animal and plant. And, you could say that evolution is a way of modeling change over time at the biological level. And when we talk about social evolution, which is what our podcast is all about, we're talking about change maybe in these other dimensions. And we've mentioned the dimension of culture, institutions, technology, and the way that those evolve or co-evolve alongside or on top of our biological heritage as a human species.
Right on. That's right. And really, it's important to bring up the fact of the natural world, as well as, and of course, the way we adapt the natural world. And then our response to those adaptations, and more that starts to get away from nature and into technology, but there's significant overlap we could talk about. But with respect to human biological evolution, we really have to always consider any conversation about our own development or our own evolution as a species or as a society in light of that very bottom level of description. Not in order to be reductionist, but in order to acknowledge the fact of Darwinian evolution and what it gives rise to us as a human species.
Yeah, totally. So inevitably we will touch in on that, especially, like Max just said, that as a foundational level, it kind of provides the constraints, like what's the design space we're sort of operating in, but it doesn't determine everything. It's not a biological determinism. And if you kind of zoom in this area, which we're going to talk about today, the psychosocial development area, this is like all the interesting shit that has changed while we've just basically been, biologically modern humans. You can see biologically modern humans, depending on how you count it, 250,000 years, like 250,000 years, and civilization itself, really something like 12,000 years, give or take. And we're really kind of talking about these changes that have occurred on the social side of that development for roughly these past 12,000 years plus or so. And then when we're talking about the psychological development, this is kind of the thing that each human goes through as we grow up. And there's this interesting intuition almost that people have. Like a lot of the theorists that we're going to talk about today have had these theories about this. There's got to be some interaction between this cultural side of the development, right? This kind of the way that civilization seems to have grown and changed over time, and this kind of psychological side of development where it's like, hey, like when I was a little baby, I couldn't walk and then I could, right? And I couldn't talk and then I could. And like you learn these things. And it's kind of you grow in a certain way. And like, wow, these are two different models of development. It's sort of development with two different meanings perhaps, but like, do they interact? Is there an interplay there?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities between them, certainly if they're not conflated, and a lot of theorists do conflate them. And, when we talk about an individuated self that is going through a process of development within some evolutionary fitness landscape, that is very similar from not only from childhood to adulthood, but as an adult, we go through various stages. There are also but by virtue of biological evolution and its constraints, I think that's a really great way of putting it. Limitations on our cognitive abilities, for example,
Yeah.
None of us is probably ever going to have the IQ of an Albert Einstein, right?
Yeah.
And yet some of the postulates of these, developmental theories might require the most advanced stages, someone be as smart or cognitively developed as an Einstein. So it's really strange. Then to turn around and talk about how smart someone is and talk about how whole cultures and their values are composed.
Yeah.
It's very strange, but there are meaningful connections between individuated selves and whole societies. And within some of these developmental frameworks, questions of I and we.
Yeah, totally. Totally. One of my favorite constraints that I bump up against often is like, it's a simple one, but maybe you've noticed this. Like, I love listening to podcasts and I also love reading and I also like writing. But like my verbal channel, there's only one of them, right? Like I can't really read an article and listen to a podcast and write something all simultaneously. Like I just said, there's just one verbal pipeline. And that really is a kind of a hard limit, right? That's part of my biological machinery that I can't. But, theoretically, the way the computers can like multiplex all kinds of communication, like perhaps, maybe someday we could, with a cybernetic implant, do a thing where you can process multiple verbal channels at the same time, but I can't, right? So this is like one of these constraints, right? It's like, sometimes I wish I didn't have to sleep for a week, but I do, right? Like, cause I just want to like do more shit or something, right? Like, right. But you can't.
But you're constrained by at least your biology. Now, some other people, I know people who can play the piano with their left hand because there's a bass line, play the piano with the right hand, which is a sort of an upper melody, and then sing on top of it.
Yep.
Right? While chewing gum.
Yep.
And it's like, how the hell do you do that? I always I'm a bass player. I always wanted to sing and play bass, but I never could. And likewise, I think, we have to, if you think of any domain of activity, the very most excellent people are head and shoulders above the rest of the pack.
Totally.
You might, call it the Olympics of anything.
Yeah.
Working for Google as a software engineer is the Olympics of software engineering. Yep. Being literally in the Olympics as a sprinter is you're just so far above everybody, the average person's ability to run. But those are all biological constraints. No one can run 200 miles an hour.
Right. Exactly. So,
yep. We are constrained by our biology. We are also constrained by some of the features, the subjective features that our biology gives rise to. And I love this about Daniel Dennett, talking about cute babies. Cuteness doesn't inhere in babies. We're evolved to find them cute so that we take care of them and not dash their heads over the rocks, right? I mean,
yeah.
And there's so many different phenomena. I mean, being jealous, being envious, being anything you can imagine that we feel as a human being was forged in the fires of the Paleolithic steppe, 100,000, 200,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And yes, there are more recent forces of human evolution that might have adapted us along certain dimensions or caused us evolutionary changes on certain dimensions. But the breadth and depth of our evolutionary composition today was already given to us 100,000 years ago.
Yep.
Or more.
Yep. Yeah, totally. It's bound to stoke a little controversy when we start thinking about these things. Cause in some ways we just generally accept, I loved your example of athletic performance. Cause this is actually one that's for the most part, not that controversial, right? It's really clear to me, certain weightlifters will, lift more weights than I ever will, right? Like because they've trained, or like certain sprinters will go way faster than I ever will. And we go, yeah, those are the Olympians. Like you said, the Olympics of this, the Olympics of that. And it's like, of course, like, we can think of really great singers or really great musicians or like this way of, it's clear there's development along certain, especially if you think of like skills, right? It's like clearly you can get way, way better at certain narrowly defined skills, like sprinting, swimming, like Michael Phelps or whatever.
Or even better when, those skills are fashioned by virtue not only of your genes but your environment. Let's say you're, I don't know, born blind, and you're born with the gift of music. You get to be Stevie Wonder.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And nobody is gonna be able to compare who has sight with the ear of Stevie Wonder. He's just going to be the best of the best. He's going to be in the Olympics because of not only his constraints on one dimension, which is he's not going to be very good at drawing pictures or seeing things, right? But he's going to be a hell of a lot better by virtue of interaction with his environment, learning music, and because of the fact that he has deficiencies in some other areas, it makes him really acute skills that he already had some genetic disposition for anyway. It's just amazing how the interplay between nature and nurture. So that is all of a piece.
Totally. You're getting into this kind of like, these ideas about, the neuroplasticity and different ways we can develop. But before we jump further there, I just want to, at least for our listeners, hit a couple places where it just seems obvious. And I just want to just do a quick review. Childhood development, we widely regard this as just accepted, right? Like kids learning to walk when they couldn't, kids don't just pop out of the womb, walk in and talking, right? Like they got to learn some shit. And you definitely see just the general capacity of human learning is something we kind of think, wow, this is almost like, it's almost definitional to being a human, right? We have a general capacity to learn new shit. And that's what school is all about. And this is something that animals learn, but they don't really learn in this kind of hypercharged way for whatever reason. But that's part of the biological inheritance that we received is something like the capacity within all humans to kind of learn and develop is uniquely human. So I think our listeners kind of go like, oh yeah, I kind of get that. And then if you talk about incredible achievements of like a Stevie Wonder or an Einstein or, Michael Phelps, we can see people are like clearly so far ahead of, they're just these outliers of incredible achievement. So obviously you can develop not just like a child, like who learns how to walk and talk, but you can develop way up into like the upper limits of human potential. And people have an intuition that that's also accurate.
I mean, well, most of us do. I mean, I think there is a subset of people who believe in some sort of blank slate theory, which is, I think, ridiculous on its face. But some people's ideologies depend on a blank slate theory in order to believe in, sort of this notion of equality for all. And when you have a very deep egalitarian instinct, sometimes it pays to believe that people are all equal, but we're not. I will never be a Stevie Wonder, nor will I ever be a Michael Phelps, a Michael Jordan, an Albert Einstein. It's just a fact. And, so,
well, this is why I was trying to point out these ones where most people have an intuition that it's accurate, but the controversy comes in when you start talking about whole populations, or when you start talking about the history of civilization and like, well, do we really want to say that, the modern way of doing things is better than the pre-modern way of doing things, or is it just all relative? Like there's some controversy within this territory, and some of it I think is worthy, and some of it becomes sort of ideological, like you said. People like sort of want to insist that like, oh, well, yeah, development is sort of the exception rather than the rule, and for the most part, we're all just a wonderful
we're all human.
collage of different things, and just different isn't better or worse or more or less developed. We don't want to use the word development, like or more or greater or whatever. We're all just sort of like our unique little snowflake selves, which is actually partly true, right? Like it is, we are a unique little snowflake in terms of the combination of things that we have as individual humans. But like this idea that we all have the capacity and we all do develop along some dimensions way more than other ones. And this has to do with just our our chosen career, our upbringing, or just the shit that we like devote ourselves to with our hours, of time, like getting more and more excellent at.
There is something to this idea of the 10,000 hours of mastery, but it should never for a moment be designed to stand in for the fact of genetics, of genetic dispositions, right? You have to activate by virtue of that mastery. You have to activate genes that you already come with. If you don't come with that set of genes, or you are unable to express those genes through interaction with the environment, namely that there are genes to be expressed, then you're never going to, it's like people who, there's whole seasons at the beginning of the show American Idol, where they just have a ball showing some of the people who didn't make it.
That's right.
Because they're so tone deaf. Yep. And I don't care how many hours those people spend trying to sing, they're always going to be tone deaf. And they're, they may be able to bring it up a notch, but there are natural constraints and natural bounds to those limits. I am never going to be able to do a reverse, especially at my age, but at no point in my life am I ever going to be able to do a reverse 360 dunk on a 10-foot hoop. Not going to happen. Always wished I could. Not going to happen. Never was going to happen. And those are constraints that we have to acknowledge. But this isn't really about sort of genetic determinism.
No.
Because we do share a lot of commonalities as human beings. I mean, as you point out with childhood development, Maria Montessori comes along and says, okay, you've got these constraints that more or less Jean Piaget in the Piagetian model identifies, and you can pretty much align it with the more or less this age group. And I think for Maria Montessori, based on Piaget, was, before 3 years old, then 3 to 6, and then 6 to 9. Mm-hmm. And then in those clusterings are more or less of the ability to abstract more and more. But in the 3 to 6 range, you concretize all of the things you learn. You want the kids to put their hands on it. You want the kids to do things that are are manipulable. And the reason for that is because human beings, generally speaking, share these phases where they have to learn through concrete environmental factors and are later able to abstract from those. This is all human beings. So of course we do share commonalities and common features, but when the kids were starting to do college calculus in high school, some of my friends, I had to just watch them go up into the stratosphere without me, because I'm here to tell you, I can't do calculus. I don't know if I have it in me. Maybe if I had done my 10,000 hours of it, I could have, but I doubt it. These are folks that had the genes.
So this is super. I want to kind of start to talk a little bit about this interaction, right? We could talk. We talked about Piaget, and if we think of this intuition, like children develop these stages. The question comes up, and this is called adult developmental psychology, or just general developmental psychology rather than childhood developmental psychology. The question is, does it keep going? Is there some way this kind of keeps going? And it's kind of funny. Like I'm going to try to give a perspective that I think is somewhat common or typical. It's kind of like, yes, when you're young, you develop, right? And then this happens and that happens. You get it. And then you become an adult aged or whatever, something like this. And the development sort of just like is over, right? It's sort of like, we're done now, right? Like you made it, whatever making it means. It's like, but what is that? I don't know. It's like, all right, we hit puberty and we go through puberty. Okay, cool. We're sexually mature, or, we reach our maximum height. Maybe that's part. It's like, we're not going to grow much taller or shorter, right? Like, and in a way at this point, we're just all sort of forking out. We're just branching out, specializing in our careers, whatever those careers might be, but we're no longer like developing. But then these other theorists, like the adult developmental theorists,
Lawrence Kohlberg,
Kohlberg, Lovinger, Keegan,
Abraham Maslow,
they are talking about this keeps going, right? Like if you want it to.
Yeah.
And one of the.
So you mean we don't stop developing cognitively, spiritually, emotionally, any of it. When we turned 18, I thought I was done. I knew everything there was to know.
That's
when
right.
I was 18.
Right. Now it's a strange thing because, I don't, like, in some ways, maybe there are certain kinds of, linguists basically say like, oh yeah, language acquisition sort of, your plasticity for language acquisition kind of ends when you're very young, right? And then or learning a new language as an adult is very difficult, or it's never quite the same, right? But then there are some people who seem to have genius level of language acquisition, and they can actually acquire, even as adults, new languages very quickly. And maybe they just have some brilliance in that particular dimension.
Nabokov. I think Nabokov succeeded in writing in the Olympics of the English language with the book Lolita, which he wrote in English. But again, I need to repeat that because this was his fifth language, which he acquired well into his adulthood. He wrote one of the crown jewels of the English language in the 20th century, if not the greatest book, in Lolita, in his fifth language.
Amazing.
I mean, and when you look, I learned German in high school when I still had some neuroplasticity with respect to language. And by the end of my having lived in Germany during college, it took Germans about 15 or 20 minutes when I would meet them for the first time to realize that I was not German, because I would kind of screw up after a while. Yeah. But it would take me about 15 minutes to find. I'm like, I would say, wie sagt man das im Englischen, or something like that. It was, how do you say that in English? And they would just, they're like, what, are you not German? And I'm like, no. And I'm searching for the word or whatever. And they'd go, oh, cool. Well, you sound really good.
Yeah.
But then I went and lived in France, and I could never pick up the accent quite the same.
Yeah.
And in fact, I learned a lot of French when I was living in France. I lived there a year, but it basically has all gone away, whereas the German has mostly stayed.
Yeah.
So there's something to all this, neuroplasticity stuff, and then exceptions to it. Yep. And people with exceptions to it are truly, stunning. And by the way, there's probably also a difference between the accent phenomenon on the one hand and the grammatical structures, the words, memorizing words and so on the other.
Yep.
So it could be that Nabokov, sounded heavily like Russian, but still wrote this amazing fucking book.
Totally.
I don't know. Yeah. I just don't know.
So one area that I think is sort of an open question, and it's something maybe I say I'd like to believe as a believer in the human potential movement, or a coach or whatever, like that there's some amount of, maybe it's a diminishing degree of plasticity as we age to kind of develop or learn new things, but everyone's got some amount of it. And, maybe we have different areas that we are able to do it based on early development or genetic factors. But this idea that as adults, we can continue to grow and mature, I like to think, and maybe the science will verify this eventually, or maybe some people think it already has, that it's possible that everyone can continue development. And I want to leap off here to the social dimension now. Like this idea that we kind of we sort of end at a certain point. The people who kind of famously try to track the interaction between the most well-known one that I think in the 20th century was Clare Graves, who had his cyclical emergent model or something like this. And he actually called it biopsychosocial development, because he wanted to kind of merge these two dimensions, the evolution in the social and the evolution in the psychological. And if our listeners are familiar with spiral dynamics and these kind of colors stages thing that spiral dynamics has, that theory of spiral dynamics was developed by two of Clare Graves' students, Chris Cowan and Don Beck. And it was basically just a kind of a popularization, if you will, a development of his theory. But this idea here is, it's almost like the society has built sort of educational constructs that take children from birth up to more or less wherever the center of gravity of the civilization is. And then we sort of say that we're done, right? But then if civilizations themselves kind of emerge further, you could say like maybe the move from pre-modernity, to modernity, which kind of is around this whatever 17th century period, that like suddenly a whole new system emerges. And now what we do is we teach kids math and science, which we didn't used to do back then. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's I think I really like the Gravesian model, which is spiral dynamics as I know it is really the popularized version of Christopher Cowan and Don Beck. So let's if you don't mind, let's talk about that model. The color scheme is a little bit different from the Ken Wilber version, which uses a slightly different colors, and I'm not even sure the reasons why he changed the colors, or his followers changed the colors. Nevertheless, I like the Beck and Cowan version of it. I think it's quite good. I do think it has its limitations, but also in identifying those limitations, there's also much to recommend about it. Okay, so imagine that the choice of colors in spiral dynamics. If you do you mind if we go through it?
Let's do it.
And we can take turns going through each layer. Okay. But imagine this sort of helical model, this double helices. Okay. And well, there's the spiral, an ascending spiral. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's not double helix yet. There's another variation on it, has double helices, two helices, double helix. But for a moment, let's just imagine an upward spiral.
Yep.
And we're going to start at the bottom. And if you look at this three-dimensional spiral, upward moving spiral in your mind, mm-hmm. just close your eyes, listener, and imagine this spiral going up into space. You will find on the right side of your mind are cool colors. Okay. And the left side of your mind are cool colors, and the right side of your mind are warm colors. Okay. So starting at the beginning, take us through it one at a time, and we can take turns with the stages because I think I remember them.
Cool.
Starting with beige, which is a rather neutral color. What is that all about?
So the beige level, according to my understanding, this is survivalist. This is, you might say, the base level animal brain, right? This is the part of you that's, when you're tired, you're gonna sleep, and when you're thirsty, you're gonna drink water, and when you're hungry, you're gonna eat, and when you got to go to the bathroom, you're gonna go to the bathroom, and when you don't have enough water or food, you're gonna go looking for it, right? And if somebody attacks you, you're gonna protect yourself, right? Yeah, and that's it.
Yeah. It's just the values that come out of those circumstances. They call beige values, and it's just the values of do what you have to do to continue to survive. That's it. Pretty simple.
Yeah.
So, right. So in the next phase, okay. And while we're talking about these folks, just think about human beings and how they live together, how they're born. They're not, none of them are born on an island, right? Or very few people are born without anyone else. Yep. In fact, it's pretty much impossible. So imagine then you have this survivalist stratum. The next stratum is purple. And purple, as far as I can remember, is more the values associated with the values and cognitive abilities of what it means to survive together in a clan or an extended family group. Mm-hmm. These are small, what we call sub-Dunbar groups, right? If we were to think about how many people we're talking about, the values associated that would be stuff like respecting your elders, and not just the living ones, but the dead ones. Yep. Animism. The idea that there's these mysterious forces in the world, it must be that there are spirits inhabiting the trees and the rocks and the this and the that, mm-hmm. right? There is a magical element to it, or the mystical appears in this stratum. And we will note, based on childhood development, that purple thinking also appears with kids. About 5, 6, 7 years old. There's a lot of magical thinking with kids. And it's really beautiful to see. They don't really distinguish between the real and the magical, not always anyway. And it's really easy to put stuff over on them about Santa Claus or fairies or this or that. And there's a reason for that, because there is in the purple phase, at some point in our development, we had to have evolved this attempt to apprehend the mysteries of the environment around us. We also had to operate in clan groups. So fidelity to your clan group was also really important.
Yep.
So that's purple.
Yep. I want to make this concrete just with a couple quick examples. These two things, like, my dad, he recently passed away, but he deteriorated with Alzheimer's for about 10 years. But as he was deteriorating, I would say he became predominantly beige at his center of gravity, right? He really didn't do much or have any really awareness of the social world. And this is another, I'm introducing this now because it's another aspect of the model. It's like the developmental model. It's not like you move, your entire self up this model. It's like we all have all these layers within us, right? And if we were, for some reason disabled through like a catastrophic accident or something like this, or if you deteriorate cognitively, you actually sort of return to this predominant layer but basically my dad was just like, sleeping and eating and drinking water and going to the bathroom. And that was it. Like there really wasn't anything else really going on for him. I mean, a few other things, but for the most part, the dad that we knew was kind of gone, and he had kind of regressed, so to speak, to predominantly beige-centered consciousness.
And of course, Clare Graves is going to say, that's why I put the bio on the biopsychosocial, because your feet always have to be on the ground. Yep. You always have to eat. You always have to go to the bathroom and defend yourself. I mean, these are things that it means to survive, and that will never change.
Goes away. Yeah.
It never goes away. So if you think about the spiral is even going on around you as a person, if you want to imagine it, you're always going to have your feet on the ground. Yep. You're always going to be connected to your biological self, which has needs.
And my purple example was like, I can remember magical thinking as a kid, right? Like it was like using the force. Like I can make that move with my mind. Or like, I can remember when I was pretty young, I went through like a very short period where I was like, if I wished hard enough, I could just transform myself into a girl, right? Like these different, of course, why couldn't you do that, right? Like it's almost like you just.
I wanted to be a demon with wings. I don't know what that means, but
yeah. Can I grow horns out of my forehead if I thought hard enough about it? And it's like, as a kid, these ideas are not implausible. You just, why don't you just try? Why don't you just see, like, this force of consciousness, how it interacts with the world in some real primordial level. And then the third one, which we haven't gotten to yet, this is red. This is the red level. I'm gonna do the red one, right? Since you did the purple.
Yeah, do it. This is the egoistic, ego-centered stage.
Totally. So, if you look at it on the individual development side, this is, sometimes people say this is the terrible twos, or this is where you kind of tell if you've been a parent, the child starts to kind of assert its own boundaries, saying no, or sometimes like doing things that sort of seem a little manipulative of the parent, like trying to make the parent do, if I do this thing, they'll pick up the food, and then I do it again and they pick it up again. Like, look at, I'm controlling them. Like there's a little bit of this, starting to exert a kind of like a power or control or manipulation over other things or other people, like, or break it. Can I break it? Can I break the thing? You know what I'm saying? Or throw the thing, or take it apart somehow, or, these kinds of manipulations. And in the social dimension, this is, and it's a little bit weird to me that these are kind of equated. This is where I start feeling like I get skeptical of the Clare Graves model sometimes.
But these warm colors are egoistic colors. They're I colors rather than we colors. Right. So the purple was a we. I want to just, remind folks of that. The beige is just like a concatenation of all the colors.
Yeah.
In a way, it's just like mud. It's this existence. But then we move to the social first. We move to the we first because we are born into clan environments. But as you start to see people come out of that, including kids, right? You get this egoistic frame.
So, you know, in the historical developmental, this is the emergence of like chieftain-centered clans. You could say this is the early version of the patriarchy, potentially, like this idea that, you know, maybe things that were more kind of like just purely hunter-gatherer groups start to encounter each other, and then they start to have warlike interactions, right? Like, and this is where the warrior role develops within the clan, or this is where it starts to center around like a predominant chieftain who's sort of, you know, the alpha, if you can think about it in this way. Like,
he gets all the resources in the pussy, because he can, right? And why wouldn't you if you can? According to red values, you're a hero for vanquishing the foes. You get the treasure. You drew the blood. You got the treasure, and the women are there for you, right?
Yeah.
This is the basis on which we think of in those set of values of conquest, valor, courage. I mean, there's some very healthy values in red. We tend to, at this stage in our civilization, think of them in an unhealthy light because no one, except for maybe like gangster rappers, thinks that getting the money and the pussy is necessarily a good thing because you can. I mean, it's we think of those in very negative terms. But in the context of someone who is able to protect the clan and really gain resources for your tribal group, even though it's motivated by an egoistic set of values of valor and conquest and getting yours, it is still beneficial to the community. So even though it's through the lens of the I, it benefits the we. And so there's a lot of paradox in there, but
well, whenever we're talking about the social dimension, there's always intrinsically going to be a we in there, whether the emphasis is more on the individual or the emphasis is more on the collective. There's this particular stage. It was a Bruce Lee movie. I don't know if it was Enter the Dragon, the villain in that one. I think this is what he said, something like Sparta, Rome, these civilizations, the samurai in Japan, these cultures worshipped strength because strength made all other values possible. And this idea that you got to actually create something like security first, and then the flourishment of all these other things that we love about culture, like the arts and the entertainment and all this kind of stuff, happens after you secure like the safety of the group. And that is the prerequisite. And this is why this value system comes in at this stage. And in a way, you could say this warrior ethos undergirds all future development of civilization at this time. And if you got rid of it, it sort of would go away. Like it sort of collapses into chaos.
I'm glad you mentioned the samurai, because I happen to be a real admirer of Japanese culture. And Japan, everything about Japan.
Me too. I love the Japanese.
I finally got to go a couple of years ago, and it was one of the most amazing experiences. And I'll come back to Japan in higher colors, higher levels of psychosocial development. But in this red, I've been recently watching this documentary on the samurai. It's on Netflix, and it's fascinating to see the absolutely bloody conflict between these Japanese daimyo clans vying for power to unify Japan and bring about peace. I mean, this is the Leviathan rationale, the Hobbesian rationale of, in order to bring about peace, there must be one who wins and holds power over all others. This is the ring in the Lord of the Rings. This is if you're not going to have perpetual conflict, you must have someone who is of supreme power. And if that's got to be Genghis Khan, and in order to do that, he's got to have the money and the women, then give it to him.
Yep.
Right? Because you benefit from that, being someone who's near Genghis Khan, someone who is of service to him. And as he and his armies serve you, your very existence depends on it. Because, by the way, there's another warlord over here who's going to take everything from you if you don't show fealty to this one. And look, those red values are strong and they persist with us today.
Well, you could say develop like from a cultural development or institution development. This is this lens. This red value meme stage is really where we get the state or the proto state. Like this is where this comes from.
I like the proto state language because I think blue really blows up so many of the values of hierarchy. Sure. Please finish what you want to say about red, because I don't want to shortchange.
Well,
red.
One final one is, we talk about how we sort of see it at the terrible twos, or historically with, cultures like Rome or Spartans or samurai. And then, I think it's still today in the warrior ethos, kind of in a validated way, like in military, hierarchy, there's some amount of that kind of warrior ethos there, was it few good men? You need me on that wall, right? Like it's like that thing he would say, like
Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, and but then it also sort of exists kind of in the shadows, in the cultural shadows. Like I have Sicilian heritage, and the Sicilians are famous for the Cosa Nostra, the mafiosos, and this idea that they kind of developed these violent like alternatives to the state. Right, in Sicily and in the East Coast of the United States, and the way that they kind of ran this protection rackets, right? But like these protection rackets were really a way for them to regulate kind of illegal commerce, like black market shit. So you could sort of see this kind of proto state thing or alternative to the state thing wherever you kind of have like a hierarchical power center, especially one that has violent enforcement in it. And this is the red thing, basically, in all of its different variations.
We talked about this on another episode with respect to the medieval Japanese, but it's like, if you failed in your telos as a daimyo, as a samurai, you would be expected to commit seppuku, which is ritual and disembowelment, right? Mm-hmm. Violence that you bring on yourself in order to somehow cleanse yourself of your shame because you failed in your job as a warrior. So when you have these warrior kind of values circling around you, you have to understand that they too are a means to survive in some evolutionary fitness landscape.
Yeah.
And the encounter of clan upon clan throughout human history requires violence as a counter to violence. And there's just nothing we can do about that. There's nothing we can do about that fact. Mm-hmm. And indeed, the subordination of one person by another is wrapped up in all of this. This is why, most of human history is one of slavery and subordination. Yep. They see it as, this is for me and my people. You and your people are instruments to that end, and this is how we survive and thrive.
Yep.
In a condition of scarcity. And you better believe it was scarce in those days.
Yeah, totally. And you could probably feel it in yourself. This is one of the things we would do sometimes in workshop land. It's like, how do you tap into that? Like, if we're making this claim, it's part of you still. Like, a lot of people really don't like this part. Like, especially, in modern civilization, we rarely need to feel like I need to use violence to protect something important. However, if I said, hey, are you a parent of a small child? Right? Okay, if you've experienced this, and you said, well, now imagine
someone is trying to violate your...
Yeah, imagine somebody is going to want to like kill your child, and you're the only person that can stop them.
Or sexually abuse your child.
Exactly.
The first thing that I would think of if I thought that someone was sexually abusing my child was how I would end them.
Right.
I mean, you can't help it.
Right. And that's it. That's where you get to feel it for yourself. Is like, oh, there it is.
Yes.
There it is. Right.
There it is. Yeah,
right there.
That's right. Yeah. I felt it, honestly, on 9/11, and I'm sorry that I did. Mm-hmm. But my first instinct is, okay, this is the system we've got. It's time to crush them, find them and crush them. Are they in Afghanistan? Go. And I was an advocate for the Afghan war, even though it turned into a 20-year, quagmire.
Yeah.
But at the time, the only thing I could think of was end them now. Right.
Yep.
And that, I didn't think of why. I mean, I was aware of the counter arguments. You got to understand, the American forces are occupying their holy lands, and, they believe in virgins and this and that. And they're trying to appeal to certain kinds of, the other culture, the other. And I'm not trying to otherize. I'm just saying this is what red values do, right? Yeah. Is to say, look, they have their own red values. They have their own purple values. Purple values for someone who is a devout Islamic terrorist would be, I get to be with all the virgins in heaven when I finish my mission.
Sure,
right. That's the magical thinking. And the red is I must vanquish the great Satan,
infidels
over there. Yeah. The infidels, and that because that's what makes me a good person in the eyes of Allah, right?
Yep.
So, but that red reaches its excesses. Okay, red reaches its excesses quickly, and it's easy to see why. I don't want to stay in the anger, the seeing red after 9/11, and with time and with a little bit more reflection and restraint, I was able to come out of that. And so also are people who live in red and realize its excesses. And this is how we get to the blue phase.
Let's do that one.
Okay. Blue, stage blue in spiral dynamics. Now we're back to cool colors. The blue is really values that support and stabilize hierarchies once they've been achieved. And I don't just mean, I mean formalized hierarchies, because formalized hierarchies evolve from conditions of red conquest, right? Mm-hmm. You do have to have a system of subordination, of rank and file, of caste, in order to maintain that order. But it also comes with values of understanding yourselves as part of a great, more of like a chain of being, or a hierarchy of being, and like the ideas like knowing your place. That sounds crazy to us in modern civilization right now, contemporary civilization, because we're so egalitarian in our orientation now. But knowing your place was so important to social order, and is important to social order for people who are really in blue. Yeah. I can think of like lots of countries right now, like in India. India still has a caste system, but it's not merely the caste system, the writ large, although that is also true. We can also think about Indian families, the place of a woman or a girl, the place and responsibilities of a man, and these complex web of relationships that go along with that we can't even understand because we're honestly culturally weird at being an acronym for this that we can talk about later. But most of the earth is in blue right now. Mm-hmm. Okay. Most of the people on earth are in some flavor of blue. And I say that tentatively because I realize that has its own problems of trying to hypostatize, which is a fancy word for trying to think of individuals as members of groups. But you see, I guess you could say if you throw a stone and hit a person on the earth, you're more likely to hit someone who's in blue. Yeah. We might call that in America modern conservatism. The conservative religious conservatives. Religious conservatives are very blue, right? So you have a culture of honor, of respect, of deference to authority. You have respecting your elders. There's so many good and healthy aspects of blue I can think of, because if you notice my accent, I'm from North Carolina. And when I go home to rural areas in North Carolina, I know I have to say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, as a sign of respect, even though I look like a city boy. Not just because I want them to trust me, but because they are suffused in a culture of respect for one another. That is a hallmark of being Southern. And it's a hallmark of people who don't have very sophisticated intermediaries to resolve conflict. You had to resolve your own conflicts, right? And to keep peace in a hierarchical state of affairs that had evolved in a prior stage from conquest, you have to adopt some of the values of hierarchy, including respect. Because everybody does have their place. There are functions in society that are enormously important at these stages of psychosocial development for whole populations.
Yeah.
Right? We can think of medieval times, the lords, the vassals, the king. They all have their functions. It wasn't just this thing that where the kings got born lucky and the lords and everybody got lucky, and the vassals, the serfs, were less so. We can look at it through that lens, certainly, but we're looking through a higher stage of development and not understanding the reason that you might configure society in such a way given the circumstances of time and place at that time.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Working the land as a serf to bring about yields so that the knights and the lords would protect you and everybody else in the kingdom.
Yep.
Was a kind of fucked up exchange, but an exchange nevertheless. Yep. So Blue is really about shoring up the values of hierarchy, but also understand, and sometimes thinking of it in religious dimensions, because obviously God sits at the top of kings and hierarchies, yep. Right? And God is the master who can rule over us all, bring peace, because we know he's watching.
Yeah.
We know God's watching, and so we shouldn't hurt each other. We shouldn't try to steal from each other, harm each other, do all this stuff, because God's watching. At this phase of psychosocial development, that is a good and healthy thing to think. Because in the absence of any mediating institution, what else you got but God?
Yeah. This is interesting. Like, historically, I think what ends up happening is, some of these innovators, like a Hammurabi or Moses or a Confucius, they kind of come along and they, within one of these, social hierarchies, structures, like whatever, wars, they stretch back to prehistory, or, battles between chieftains and such. And they go, hey, check this out. If we write this down, right? And then we say, like, this thing that we're writing down, might be something that, we as modern people look back on and go like, oh, this is just perpetuating or reifying a certain kind of social order, or a certain kind of dominance hierarchy, which it sort of is from a certain point of view. But you could be like, well, they're actually innovating for their time. They're like, hey, let's not have to revert to whatever the preferences are of the strongest dude around. You know what I'm saying? Like, let's stabilize. Let's just say, and they tell a story. They actually tell almost like a mythological story of like, this is how it was always meant to be. And God decided that this is how it was always meant to be. I went up to the mountain and he gave me the commandments, or whatever it is. This kind of story about like, we're going to write down a set of rules that essentially take the order that we already have and formalize it so that it continues into the future. And then we say, let's tell a story. Let's have celebrations. Let's have rituals. Let's have holidays, liturgical seasons, or feast seasons, or whatever you want. These whole body of social traditions that essentially perpetuates the value meme. This set of things that get installed into children very, very young, and essentially this is all that you kind of know. And this is why they feel very different from each other. Like traditional Confucian culture feels very different than traditional Islamic culture, or traditional Christian culture, or Jewish culture, whatever. They all have their unique flavors. Like there's actually a strong, almost like a thick, I think anthropologists call this what is it? It's not like, there's like lightweight culture versus heavyweight culture. I'm not quite getting the right, like shallow versus deep culture. These cultures feel like there's a lot to them. There's a lot of heft to them.
For sure. But at the end of the day, though, the patterns of overlap are profound.
The themes are similar. Totally. The themes are very similar.
Yeah.
And as a child, you can sort of recognize this, when the kid is like, oh, like I live in a world with other people. And, when a kid's sort of like, am I supposed to do this? Am I not supposed to do this? Is this the right way? Is this the wrong way? Hey, dad. Hey, mom, tell me, Is this good or is this bad? Is that right or is that wrong? When your kid starts kind of like asking like what's allowed or what's not allowed, this is them kind of in that, at the individual psychological developmental stage, starting to touch into like, I'm in a world where there's rule sets and I want to understand what those rule sets are, because that will enable me to succeed in this world of rule sets. They're not thinking about it at that level of sophistication. They're just intuiting it, but that's sort of what they're doing. And I remember, like, Mom, is this bad or is this good? Right? Like, that's the question.
Yeah. They're bouncing around in these invisible rules and learning from them almost through diffusion. But it's like when my kids do this all the time, they encounter, they forget to do their chores, and, they don't get their, it's like I tell them, okay, you guys, by virtue of getting to live here, eat, and have me take care of you, right, have to do certain things. But I'm going to give you an incentive anyway in the form of an allowance. So I give them this big spiel, and they're looking around, picking their nose. They're not paying any attention to anything I'm saying. And then when they forget to do their chores, or they don't do them correctly, I don't pay them as much. And they're like, but Dad, they're angry for a minute.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's like, but I provide to you. That is my function as father. That is my place in this family hierarchy, right? And if you don't do your chores, you don't get the good things. You don't get the good stuff. You have a function as a member of this family. I have a function as a member of this family. We all have responsibilities to this hierarchical social order. And it ceases to be a hierarchical when you're no longer dependent on it. But as long as you are, you will take orders from me, you little shits. You know what I mean? And they get it. Over time, they get, they're good boys. My little girl is too young to appreciate this yet. She's only 7 months old. She's still in beige. Beige, if you want to use that language here. But, my 5-year-old and my 14-year-old are very much learning about blue values here at home.
Yep.
And that's okay. I mean, I kind of wish I had, like my father taught me, to say yes sir, no sir to him, which I did. Mm-hmm. Because there's an automating factor with these values when you teach someone the language of deference.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so glad that my dad taught me that. I'm so happy that he did. And I can't explain why. Because I always respected him, even if I, advanced or outshone him educationally or whatever, advanced in my career or something like that. My dad died a retired truck driver, and yet I always will respect him.
Yeah. And
not just because he inculcated me, but because he raised me to be a good person and to respect other grown ass people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's people who have wisdom.
Yeah.
If you respect people who are older, they are likely to have wisdom. That is a good and healthy value of blue.
Totally.
Now, okay, I've talked on and on about blue. Anything you want to add about blue, or do you want to go on to the next phase?
A couple of just quick things that will set us up for the transition. Again, here, we also see the formation of the early state potentially, or the idea of the kingdom. And we actually almost see this tension. If you look at these kind of biblical stories or like old mythological stories, like, well, what makes a good king? Well, a good king is one who follows the law, right? Like, in a way, this idea of like, is the king above the law, or does the king have to abide by his own laws that he creates? And then this kind of, we tell these stories. Well, this king was a good king because he abided by the laws that he said. And this idea that the law is itself starting to like become ascend and become equal to the king, right? And it's not just like, it's whatever the boss says, right? Might makes right. It's actually, the king cares about the kingdom lasting, like after, right? He's gone, right?
Oh gosh, that's so funny, Porch, because I don't know if we have any British listeners, but on a program one time I was watching, it was really odd because in the idea in this program, in American, almost in like Americana, in our lore, our constitutional lore, we always, in civic education, mention the Magna Carta.
Yeah.
Did you learn about the Magna Carta as a kid?
Yeah.
Well, in Britain, they don't learn about it as nearly as much as we do, which I find absolutely fascinating. Right? So we have integrated the idea of the Magna Carta as part of our lore so that we have greater respect for the Constitution, because what that sets out is the limits to what the king can do in light of the law that was made. Just as you said.
Totally. I mean, at that point, we get full on, I think, Orange, a constitutional state, is a full on the next stage. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're right at the top of blue there with the Magna Carta. We're topping. We're going like, oh, we're almost here.
Yeah,
we're almost to the next level. And what is
the orange level? This is what we think about it is, a whole bunch of things come in at this level. Like the emergence of modernity, the emergence of the modern state, the emergence of, in Western history, there's the emergence of these, Enlightenment philosophers, people like Locke and Mill and, Hobbes.
Is enlightenment self-interest, enlightened self-interest. It's not the self-interest of conquest and stepping over dead bodies to get to some prize that you're bringing back to your clan, but rather the selfishness of the business person, the enlightened self-interest. From the butcher and the baker that we get all the good things. That it's not because that they're being kind to us. It's because they're self-interested, but in an enlightened way. They got to do what they got to do to survive. They're producing for us. They're serving for us. We got to give them something back. It's the notion of reciprocity, of markets, and of science. Science is a big part of it. What's that all about? Why does that come up in Orange?
They're all of a kind, I think. And at the time, this is definitely a Western-centric account of the whole thing. But I think, historically, this is where the West was where it sort of really emerged in a huge way over a period of time. And, the church kind of predominated the cultural world at the time, the Catholic Church in the Western Europe and the Eastern Orthodox Church and Eastern Europe, and this idea that, like God grants the power to the kings, right? The power comes down, and that we say what things are or aren't, or we're the arbiter of truth, these kinds of things. But, a lot of, I don't think there's sort of one clear cause and here's an effect, but like all these things sort of happened. You could say, Copernicus and the heliocentric theory, or Galileo, or these folks that were
Galileo is really a great example. I think he's in this hyper blue setting, right? Surrounded by the church, and he's really this symbol of the Renaissance. But the Renaissance, which is Renaissance, is a French word for rebirth. Probably comes from a similar Latin word, but he's operating at a time when he's trying to get some elbow room. He's like, oh my God, I'm searching for truth. I'm finding out something. I'm trying to find out something about the world. And that is despite the proclamations of the church elders and the proclamations of power. It is despite it. So it is something else. So it's not just a rebirth, although that is also true, because we have so much of this flourishing in the Greeks and the Romans on the Agora, for example. But really, it moves into science and into like Baconian methodology, because there's suddenly this I-centered universe, this Cartesian notion, I think, therefore I am. But goddamn, let me think. Let me think for myself.
Yeah, even that we're so ensconced in this idea, like you should think for yourself, or like, it's almost just like a platitude. Like of course I should think for myself. Why wouldn't I? Of course I want you to think for yourself. It's like this idea is almost just like the water we're swimming in this era of time. But like, it wasn't really the idea that you should be thinking for yourself, or that people thought that other people should be thinking for themselves, was not common really all that much at the time.
That would have been so subversive at that time. And it was. That's why Galileo ended up in prison. You subvert the authority and the values of hierarchy by deigning to ask questions by thinking
Yep.
for yourself, everything you need to know is already in this book right here,
Right.
which has been canonized and comes from God.
Yep.
What do you think you have? How dare you think you have anything to add to these scriptures, which are given to us straight from God?
Yep.
But we take it for granted today.
Totally.
Not because we have lost our religion, although some of us have.
Yep.
Some of us have lost our religion. But by and large, thinking for yourself it's one of the platitudes that we teach our kids. I want to teach you to think for yourself.
Yeah.
But Dad, you told me to think for myself. That's why I'm arguing with you.
Yeah.
Well, go do your chores.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I mean, we could talk endlessly about this one, and it's very, very familiar. Just the thing for our listeners to keep in mind is like, this was new at a certain point in time. It comes with a whole lot of things like, Adam Smith's ideas, about markets and exchange and like, these innovations, like, the mercantile, culture of Europe, kind of centered around like fair trade and exchange in these kind of port cities or larger cosmopolitan areas, the invention of the corporation, the Dutch did, and the English followed on with that. Limited liability, you can see the roots of capitalism, right? The kind of like predominance of, market forces as ways of kind of negotiating things rather than having them dictated from on top. This is where it becomes really big. And anytime you see historically, like, Socrates, right? And the up through, Aristotle and, this is a version of it that happened earlier on in the Western world. And then you could see potentially historical examples of this in other, like the Indian subcontinent or in China. Anytime you see somebody who's like, oh, like, let me think outside the kind of like accepted norms of the culture and try to figure something out for myself, or like a sort of a decentralized fair market exchange idea becomes sort of like, oh, let's just do it this way. These are the, you could say this is like early Orange, right? Orange sort of tends to emerge, according to this theory, when you have an established social order, and then you can kind of build on top of it these things that lead to scientific discovery or innovation, or, the building up of like, profits or capital or industry, and all these things kind of come out of this particular stage, but essentially it's based on a kind of a empiricism and a rationalization of the world around us, and this idea that an individual human can to some degree figure shit out for themselves, which is, there's a little bit of a mythology of Orange in here as well, which I think is an interesting thing to critique. But that idea, we see it developmentally in our teenagers, right? And the kind of like, let me question the authority. I'm going to rebel against the society. I'm not going to accept the order that's being sort of imposed on me. And I want to figure out for myself what I really want to do with my life or with my career and this sort of thing. That's kind of, once you get enough, psychological development as an individual, that's when you start feeling something like this desire to kind of like, who am I and what do I want, like as a person.
Yeah. And it's strange. I think about a culture that is, and it's not to say to the exclusion of these other tiers or other bands of color, but I imagine, going back to Japan for just a moment, straddling these two, a culture that truly straddles. If the weight of the left foot and the rate of the right foot is straddling blue and orange. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you go into a Japanese corporation, the corporation is orange all day long. It is an orange construction, right? Yep. Sony Corporation. Or Toyota. I go to the top floor and I meet the president of in Tokyo, right?
Yep.
Of one of these major corporations. And what is the first thing that we do to each other when I enter the room?
Bow.
We bow, right? So Japan is a culture that is firmly 1 foot in blue and firmly 1 foot in orange. And really, this persists to this day.
Yep.
And it makes it such a beautiful culture. The thing about, and look, and it's the same in my home state, going back to North Carolina or here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
these southern states, they're called the New South because the North, developed so much more economically, so much more quickly in orange, right? That they shed so much of their blue. But the South didn't shed its blue so much. And part of that is a factor of the Civil War, its dependency on agriculture and then, obviously further back from that, slavery, which kept it sort of in the amber of an agrarian society, which is usually blue. But as after Reconstruction and throughout, as the South started to develop, I mean, today you have so many of these fantastic, beautiful sort of like orange centers. My hometown of Charlotte is the second largest banking center in America, behind New York, and almost nobody knows that. But it is a mega banking center. Bank of America is headquartered there, and huge, a bunch of other banks. Anyway, that fact, coupled with this sort of rich Southern culture that is still, has all these blue values, makes it very much like Japan in this regard. There are very distinct cultural elements to Japan that I find interesting. The desire to have things be perfect, to practice things over and over again, right? Yeah. These things, I don't know how you categorize those in terms of spiral dynamics, but I love that about the Japanese. That's not something so much you would see in a Charlotte or an Atlanta or an Austin where I live now. But certainly these are places with 1 foot in blue and 1 foot in orange. And that's all I want to say about that.
Cool. Like, I want to get us through maybe the next couple, maybe a little bit more quickly, but like, yeah, we definitely have to hit this postmodern green thing, which is the next one. Cause these are the ones that are like, these are the current battle lines in our present day culture wars. Yes. And, there's one way of looking at it as like, well, these are just different things. Another way of looking at it developmentally. And I think there's some ways of criticizing this entire model. But like, there's still a deep truth about this interaction between individual development and social development. I'm hoping people are kind of at least grasping onto a plausible version of this in the form of spiral dynamics as we go.
Right. And look, at every stage we've identified, I think we have covered that there's some excess or some unhealthy thing about that phase that is trying to break through into the next phase. Yep. And once that breakthrough has happened, there's a bleeding through effect. Yep. And I don't know if Clare Graves or Don Beck or anyone else would describe it as this, but there's an upward pressure into what is going to become the next thing. And this is a result of what they do say of circumstances in the environment changing. Yep. Right. So for example, in 1970, between 1960 and 1970, it was probably the time where, well, I think you could go back before that. You could go back to Dickensian England. Yep. You could go back to the Romantic era. Rousseau. Yep. Mm-hmm. The counter Enlightenment really is the earliest. The counter Enlightenment. Yeah. I think you can view in some respects the modernity, the romantic part of modernity as the counter Enlightenment in some ways. It's let's be a little more communal. The values of this stage are, there's so many excesses with this brutal industrialization that creates so many inequalities of outcome. The way we make decisions together is always because of some asshole CEO or some leader over here, which is vestiges of blue that have made, that have arisen. But instead, in orange, the people who make the decisions are the people who have the most money, not the people who have the most religious authority. Yep. So, yeah, these dominance hierarchies persist in these big companies, and these factory workers are treated like shit. Yep. So what do we do about that? We see this and we feel like there's something wrong here. And green starts to exert itself people need to have a voice. Everyone needs to have a seat at the table. Let's all figure out how to get together and love one another right now. So it's kind of a hippie phenomenon,
Yep.
right? Between the most pronounced reaction to orange in America was the 60s.
Yep.
Right. And it's really the first explosion into green, the green meme, which is another we-centered idea, or versus an I-centered notion. And in green, we got this. We not only got the values of what you might call the hippie era, which is, more communal, more egalitarian, more about consensus. Like, hey, I want to check in with you. I want to make sure that you're okay. Are you okay with this? Or am I okay with this? Let's talk about it. Let's achieve some sort of consensus, community consensus. And it's not the community of the clan. It's a much more cosmopolitan view of community, a more egalitarian view of community. The idea that you could be a world community.
Yep.
And so these green values start to predominate, and one of their more unhealthy aspects, I'm going to argue, and not all our listeners are going to agree, but one of the most healthy aspects of it, even though cognitively and intellectually, I think there's a lot to recommend about this cultural relativism stuff, okay, is where we start to get the seeds of both in postmodernism and in the mimetic warfare that has come out of postmodern modernism and critical theory.
Yep.
So I'd like to get you to react to that in without spending too much time in green, because I think it's really interesting. Because you're right, the culture wars today, I think Ken Wilber's totally right. The mean green meme, which is taking these values too far into an unhealthy place, is really the summum bonum of woke culture right now. You have these healthy values in green, and yet woke culture abandons most of them in favor of egalitarianism at all costs.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll do a little healthy and then unhealthy, because I think there's a lot of innovations, and whether you think, what's great about the green meme is really just actually rooted in the Enlightenment theory. Habermas actually thinks of it as just really an extension of the Enlightenment project. Or if you think about it as like counter to the Enlightenment in a kind of more, Rousseauian counter Enlightenment way, the idea is, anytime you see these social movements, like Dickens caring about, the poorhouses and of industrial England, or, Marx, or, writing Das Kapital and critiquing the capitalist system, or, the suffrage movement, or let's break up the trust busting of the progressive era in the early, 20th century of the US. Like this idea of like, hey, like let's improve conditions. It has a little bit of a like, we don't just need to keep, more. We don't need to keep just like build more, it's like we can actually take some of the more, like this surplus that we've had, and like use it to just improve conditions for everybody. Right? Like, why do we have, we used to send kids down into the coal mines. We don't do that anymore. We have childhood labor laws that stop that from happening. And like, we could debate as to whether the state regulation or market
upsides and downsides.
Yeah. Market forces would have done it. But in either case, the ethos of a kind of like a pro-social thing, any kind of social movement to reform a thing or make it better is really kind of that feeling, that progressive feeling, which is kind of the healthy expression of green. Like this idea that we can take all that we have like established in modern Western industrial, liberal capitalist society, and it doesn't have to just like, just stay the same, just more of the same, but we can actually like improve things, right? And this is where we get gay marriage comes out of this, or let's take care of the environment comes out of this. All these things kind of come out of it. And there's almost like a device that's used to do this, which is like, well, you've got to question the narrative that's being given to us. That is the narrative that's used to just like fortify or buttress the power structure as it currently exists. And you got to kind of like poke holes into it somehow. So then what you got to do is you got to talk about, like, you got to create a counter narrative, whatever this is. If it's like, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. So you're creating a narrative about, like, what's the stuff that they left out of the history books, right? And we're going to deconstruct this thing, or we're going to show how, like, it's implicit in what's being said. It's not explicit, right? This is a narrative that, like, the powerful elite are using to justify their own existence. This type of device, you can call it like a critical social approach, or critical mode that, is really forwarded by, was it Horkheimer and Weber and those guys in the Frankfurt School kind of originated this. These were sort of like, Marxists who were kind of trying to evolve the theory, all the way up to, the hippies and stuff. Yeah, let's try to, like, deconstruct this thing by, analyzing its language or analyzing its power or thinking about who benefits. But the thing with that device is it's sort of like it's almost like a universal demolisher of everything, right? Like, you can always use it. Like, no matter what the thing is, you could just deconstruct. You could use it to deconstruct itself, right? I mean, you could. Right. It just implodes upon itself. It's just a funny thing where you're just like, well, that can't be right.
Well, and it's there's what's interesting about postmodernism is they identify the fact of power in language, and it's got going for it. It's a very specific kind of claim, but at the same time, to make such a claim requires the abandonment of some notion of orange, which is capital T truth, and seeking truth.
Yes.
Right. And at a certain level intellectually, I agree with that. There is no capital T truth. We can go into all kinds of reasons why that will take us to many, many philosophical depths. And yet I see the problematic nature of the green meme and of postmodernism in jettisoning truth, because it's so easy to default to this position that all you have to do is say something enough times to make it so. And they still don't believe that's true. It's just an act of power. So you come into your power as this critical theorist, you just make shit up. Now, they wouldn't say it as that. They would say it as something like of a speech act of power, or contra power or something like that. Even, bizarrely, speak truth to power comes out of the green meme, but there's nothing to do with truth half the time. It's only a grain of truth that makes it remotely plausible, usually when these folks are using these kind of devices. And then you get this weird phenomena of, like, okay, if I can just make assertions, and if enough people make these assertions in solidarity, it will form this simulacrum of truth.
Yeah.
Then we can use that solidarity to form an alternative power structure that we can inhabit and that has to get funding. And so that's how you have all of these people, these enclaves of set up in the education departments of major universities and all these academic centers, all of these. You've got these HR departments now that have been colonized by this kind of green meme. And there's actually, bizarrely, it's like a market for it now. So every time, and they know they need to continue to expand their ranks and expand the resources that are going to those positions by continuing to make these claims. The more you make the claims, the more the companies feel like they need to have a diversity, equity, inclusion officer or something like that. But it forms this negative feedback loop. I mean, sorry, it's a positive feedback loop, but it's negative in the sense that it's destructive to the social order that may or may not be guilty as charged.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, as you said all of those things, I can feel the part of me that was like, oh, let's talk about the good things about green, but also I want to kind of move on past it to a degree, like, and go back to our theme here, right? Like, we rabbit holed on spiral dynamics, and there's a little more to it. There's actually a couple of colors to come, but this is really the dividing of these final three. the traditional, the blue, the orange, the modern, and the green, what we're calling the postmodern, these actually form the battle lines of our current culture wars. And you could think of them as developmentally or linearly, or maybe you don't like to think of them in that way. The idea that we could critique this entire social developmentalism altogether, right? This is actually one of the things that Green likes to do, which is to say, like, there is no social progress. There's just, the changing of hands of coalitions of power from one to another. And it's essentially random, you could take, kind of a romantic view, a Rousseau view. It's like, actually, the bygone past, the noble savage, like, which is like a word, it's a term you're not supposed to use anymore, but like, whatever, like, the indigenous peoples, you can feel that, they had it right. And everything that they do was superior.
Oh yeah.
And we have just corrupted it with the past 12,000 years of agricultural society and religion and science and industry and all this kind of shit. So we should go back. The other one you have is traditionalism. This is kind of these, there's forms of it in Catholicism or Judaism or Islamism, which is kind of like, hey, we need to go back to reinstituting religious code as the supreme law of the land, like Sharia or whatever, or Catholic integrism is a version of that in the Catholic movement. And like, that's the way we should go back, right? With like this is a thing where the
Australians are really today going through their crisis of conscience about colonizing Australia. And of course, their indigenous population there, indigenous Australians, the green meme in Australia is really profound and it has healthy aspects and unhealthy aspects. One of the healthy aspects, I truly believe, is the veneration of the wisdom of indigenous Australian people. But the problem with it is they're taking it to such a degree of apotheosis by virtue of their sort of green meme, which is saying, let's go back and pick up purple and live by purple, but in our own distinctly Western way. So the green meme adherents in Australia, who are most always white people, are saying, let's go. We did wrong. We not only did wrong by them, but we need to completely go back to living just as they have lived ever since we arrived. Right. So it's almost like green is proposing retrogression. Yeah. Both in the broad sense of human development and progress, but also in the sense of psychosocial human development. To say that they had it all along, they had it right all along. It's this ancient wisdom of the indigenous Australians. Yeah, I can understand why someone would want to think that, to absolve themselves of the guilt of being the inheritors of a colonial past. Right. But there's no going back on the spiral of psychosocial development without serious problematic bloodshed.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. And there are some people like Ted Kaczynski who believes that we should, right? He's going to bomb us back into the Stone Age, if he could, right? But, he's luckily in prison.
Because we're maggots on the planet, according to Ted Kaczynski.
So what I love about what you're saying here is there's like something very interesting at this transition. I sometimes think of green as more transitional from orange to the next stage, which is yellow in the spiral dynamics model. But I want to take a little bit of a detour before we come back to that model. Because in a way, here we are summarizing this in-depth model that other people came up with. And I think there's some things I want to add to this conversation that I think of as my critiques of these types of models, which is they often exist in a certain like linear type of geometry, or a spiral geometry, kind of has like a linearity to it. Yeah. Where it's like, oh, but it's going somewhere. And I think if there's a concept that comes from Darwin, really, but also interestingly is echoed in this kind of green thing, is it's not, I don't think it's really actually going anywhere necessarily. Right? Like the tree of life in the evolution, biologically speaking, is a tree structure, right? Like it's not like this old chain of being, with like there's the primate on the left and there's this upright human on the right, and there's these different, up and to the right sort of progression. That's actually, this was actually a pre-Darwinistic versions of evolutionary theory. Actually had a pre-Darwinistic phase, and there was a bunch of debates, and Lamarck was
Lamarckian evolution,
and the great chain of being theorists, and this idea that, like, humans are atop of a thing and everything sort of leads up to us or something, and the monkeys are down below it. But if you think about it from a Darwinistic point of view, right, like the tree of life kind of goes all the way back to whatever the origin of life was on Earth, and it just sort of keeps branching outwards. And all of the species and all the organisms that are alive today, we're really just sort of like the outermost leaves of this gigantic tree that goes throughout time, right? So in a way, certain, like Stephen Jay Gould, and there's a certain kind of like Marxist leaning biologists who love to emphasize this aspect. And this is where Green and Darwin sort of interact a little bit, like this idea of, hey, it's not going towards one specific place, like a teleological progression. It's actually just expanding in its degrees of complexity. And, it might end up going this way, it might end up going that way. And I think it makes sense in a way that a lot of this deconstructive postmodern green meme thing is trying to be like, well, it's been growing too much over this way, so let's make it go over this way, right? And who's to say that this way is not the progressive way and that way is not, you know what I mean? Like, you can.
Well, there's two responses to that. I mean, one is that we have to remember that Graves and Beck and Cowan all said that these values and the corresponding cognitive developmental aspects of this stuff, that these emerge. And by the way, there's emergence, not a decision. It wasn't a day when somebody says, "Hey, here's a green flag over here." Totally. Right? These are there's a set of evolutionary pressures around you that are contrived and are natural, both. And humans are going, wait a minute, something's wrong with this, something's not right. And they're looking for a different set of norms, values, whatever. And a few of them perhaps have the cognitive capability to do so. This could be a process that happens at random, and it could be but if we really think of this as an evolutionary phenomenon, it is going to happen, as you say, by virtue of what is needed to survive and thrive in the surroundings. That's the first thing. The other thing is we can't forget that in the spiral, and this is not a critique of the spiral dynamics, folks. This is actually, I think, an important feature of the theory, is that you embrace and transcend all of the prior stages. Now, you might think that, there is some sort of equilibrium over here. So it's like people who are living in this orange setup over here are fine. They don't progress. They don't change. They don't ever go into green or retrogress into blue or anything like that. They're just sort of hanging out in this little commercial city over here. But anytime we regard those folks, we have to realize that deep inside them, if you like, is blue, is red, is purple, is beige.
Yes.
You never can shed yourself of the prior stages. And there are good reasons for that, both in terms of the cultural development or outgrowth of these phenomena, but also because in some sense, that's what it means to be human.
Yes. Because
as you said, this reflects itself in developmental phases of kids. Yes. It's not a perfect match, but it's there. And it's interesting that as we've been talking about this, we've given examples from history, but we've also given examples of psychological development. Yeah. We could probably also give examples of our own personal reactions to certain situations that could be more on the red side, more on the blue side, more on the orange side. It is biopsychosocial. It is all of that shit. And that makes it less trustworthy as its theory, because a lot of people would argue it's trying to do too much. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, this is yet another kind of critique of the spiral dynamics in the Gravesian model versus some of these other people who have tried to like split out. Kohlberg is like, I'm just going to focus on moral development, or, Keegan, I'm just going to focus on cognitive development and not try to connect this thing over here with this other social, historical, developmental thing over there.
But you said something a minute ago that was really interesting, and I think is both critical and part of the theories. Could be critical of and part of the theories. What you said was, and I hope you'll expound on this for a moment, that all of these phases of development, whether from Kohlberg or Keegan or Clare Graves, are about, in some respects, not just responses to environmental factors, but complexity.
Yeah.
Talk about that for just a minute, if you don't mind.
This is the idea that it's not like better or worse. It just becomes a little bit more like a nuanced. So, we can kind of, if you think about your critical thinking class, or if people, it's very popular to talk about cognitive biases these days. And like some of these things, like, it's like either or thinking. Sometimes it's called the black and white fallacy, right? It's like, well, it's either got to be true or it's got to be false, right? Or, ways of,
you're either a Republican or a Democrat.
Yeah. Politics gets collapsed into the left and right thinking. And, in a lot of ways, people always think it's other people that are committing these like lack of complexity or less nuance thinking, but I'm the one who's got the nuance kind of thing. And, the truth is, I think a lot of people have the place where they kind of collapse onto more simple thinking. And then when you kind of get a more nuance, you might, this is my hobby horse of where the nuance comes in. And let me tell you all about the nuance of whatever it is, race relations or something like this. I'm the nuanced one. And the thing is, like, I think there's always nuance possible. And this is really, I'm just kind of using this word as maybe just another substitute of complexity, but these complexity of cognition is to kind of recognize that, a human body, a society, a social system is, in math terms, like a complex dynamic system. And there's not a thing. You can't just go like, this is caused by that, right? There's actually multi-factor causes on all these kinds of phenomenon. And even, you could even get deeper into like epistemics and be like, well, what do we mean when we say a certain word? Define your terms. How do you measure that this word applies or this word doesn't apply? Or we create degrees or shades of gray. This is not it's not like there or not there, but it actually exists like a percent. What percent is it there? Like almost like a Bayesian probabilistic reasoning. What is the likelihood that this explanation fits or not? And like this type of complexity of thinking, I think I have found with a lot of the people that I know who I've like remained connected with over the years, eventually you talk and think about enough things and you kind of hit this place of like, it's almost like, well, shit's just too complicated to really totally understand it. Or this other idea that like, whatever I think my understanding of what the hell's going on is, I know is incomplete, right? Because I've updated and changed my mind before. I'll probably update and change my mind later. Sometimes I thought, I painted everything with one brush in this particular way and actually break it apart and there's other parts underneath there. I mean, you could even say the spiral dynamics color model isn't complex enough, right? It sort of like deletes nuance out of these things. But like I do think, ability to embrace complexity thinking is a big chunk of humble pie, really, right? It's, like Nassim Taleb goes on and on about black swan events and shit like this. It's like the unknown. We really just kind of don't know. Like sometimes shit will happen and we'll be like, this doesn't, like a surprise factor, but like somebody who's embraced complexity sort of anticipates that there are such things that they could be surprised by, and that's going to have an impact. It's going to actually potentially ripple through your belief structure. And rather than kind of be like, let me firm up my belief structure to like delete that, like that's not a real thing, right? Like instead, how do I incorporate it?
This is, I think, a good because we can sort of dance within and outside of regarding the framework that we've been talking about, but also within it, from without and from within, because I think the yellow stratum of psychosocial development, if you want to buy that, goes to second tier. Okay. Mm-hmm. I don't remember if Clare Graves was the one that broke it into two tiers. I think that was Beck and Cowan.
I actually think it was Beck and Ken Wilber. I don't know if Cowan did that. I'm not sure. There's a big schism within that community about this.
Well, Don Beck certainly believes that there is a seismic or just a giant chasm, a quantum leap between green and yellow. Mm-hmm. And you said earlier in the program that you thought that it was almost like a transitional phase to yellow, which I found really interesting. Now, they believe that there's a huge quantum leap between green and yellow. I tend to agree with them on that point. But it's important to talk about what yellow is for just a moment. Sure. Yellow and its corresponding set of values is really, it's another eye-centered set of values. Mm-hmm. Right. But it's paradoxical in the sense that you can sort of take the I out of it. You might start with, I am epistemically humble before this set of truths because I don't know everything I can't know everything under the sun, because so much of the world around me is a property, demonstrates the property of emergence.
Yes.
And not design or planning.
Yes.
Right? So you're comfortable with the idea of emergence. Yes. Emergence being the phenomenon where you get all of these, by virtue of either simple rules or protocols, agents operating within an increasingly complex system can give rise to an order that we could never have planned, like a great barrier reef of civilization or nature or whatever the fuck you're trying to think about, right? And that epistemic humility of yellow is like, wow, not only do I see where I came from all of a sudden, because this yellow sunglasses in some way makes me look back and see that I've got beige, red, purple, blue, orange, green in me.
Yeah.
Right? I can see that now. Oh my God. And I can see that I need to use these different values in different contexts according to the likelihood of my being successful or not in those contexts. You become that, second tier thinkers become much more, they become much more versatile in their use of all of the colors and all of the values and understanding the circumstances of time and place for which they're important. But yellow is also good at identifying emergence. Mm-hmm. And emergent systems and constructing the protocols of emergent systems. And that is what makes it, to me, Don Beck in a speech I heard him say live one time, that this was the master color. This was the master color. He probably said this because he knew he was sitting in a room full of greens, and he absolutely was. Okay. Yeah. Trying to get them to come on to yellow was to say, this is such an important, he might have been manipulating his audience. Sure. I don't know, but I think there's something that has independent level of truth to it, in that once you start to see the matrix.
Yes.
When you ascend to the second tier.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And beyond that is just degrees of complexity. Can you think in holonic terms? Can you not only respect and venerate emergence, but in some sense apotheosize it, which is to give it a spiritual dimension, and to see sort of this planetary totality. And once you do, then you begin to leave yellow and go into turquoise, where you see this planetary holonic emergence and interconnection. This holistic version of yellow, right? That's what turquoise is. So I just quickly describe those because I know we're running out of time. Yeah. Because people who fancy that they're in yellow and turquoise think they've got it all figured out.
Yeah.
Right. And I pick on people in the spiral dynamics group I belong to online, because I frequently say to people, where they're picking on capitalism or something, saying it's rotten. Orange is just rotten and it's ruining the world, right? And I tend to think, and I'm a very orange oriented person, so I tend to think that green is ruining the world. And I speak disparagingly about woke, even though it has grains of wonderful and healthy aspects. Woke culture has healthy aspects to it, but has just gotten out of control in my view. It's important to, as one who's, if you believe you've ascended to the second tier, and especially cognitively, to be more circumspect in your analysis about other value memes.
Totally.
And you do so by virtue of reckoning with the extent of complexity. Yes. And I don't want to be too reductionist about that, but if I had to bring a strong emphasis to the conversation, I would say that reckoning with the fact of complexity at different stages really is a through line to some of these systems. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, at least as an intellectual heuristic.
Totally. I don't think there is either. I mean, you're touching on something that's essential to whatever this is thing that comes after green. And I want to take a step back from, whether it looks like what Beck and Cowan and Graves and folks said yellow and turquoise, or Ken Wilber say it is, or whether it's something else. And let's see if we can develop an intuition for it. Like, even this whole conversation is part of that. Like, you could say this idea that we can see something like individual development and something like social development through history, and we can see the ways that these kind of interact with each other, is itself a style of thought, which we could say has some of these qualities of complexity to it, right? Like, or to notice patterns, like instead of saying like, well, Buddhism and Islam and Confucianism and Hinduism and Christianity are all just different. Look at how different they are. Instead, you go like, but look at these themes that emerge across cultures in their most traditional formats, right? Oh, strong dietary laws, strong regulations around sexuality and marriage and reproduction. Like, why do all these things, even if they differ in the details, why do they all do a similar sort of a thing, right? Like, oh, that's a pattern that sort of, we can sort of see a thing. It's an indicator of this style of thought that we're saying kind of is this, whatever this is, whatever comes after the postmodern thought, right? This integral thought, or this yellow thought, tier thought, or, teal in Ken Wilber's colors, or whatever. Like, I'm trying to poke at, like, where do we start to kind of feel it? Another one is this is one I wanted to kind of bring back. To whatever degree I have skepticism about any particular model actually being the right one, in terms of like this, we look backward and it looks like a trail. It looks like we had this road and we went here, and then we were here, and they were here. But like, looking forward, it's like a tree. It's like we're branches, and we don't know exactly where it's going to go, but it sort of seems like kind of it's going in this general direction. But even if you are like, I don't like, some people are like, I really like, this developmental theorist way better than this other one, and here's why. And people get all nitpicky about why this developmental model is better than another one. But if I step back from all of that and say, like, is there a truth just generally to this pattern of development? I think there is. And we actually see this in some flavors of evolutionary theory. So, we talk about animal domestication, right? We domesticated agricultural animals like cows, or sheep and goats. We also domesticated things like dogs and cats to be kind of companions to us, like emotional support, or spend time with us, or, protect us from rodents and whatever, warn us of invaders. Yeah. It's like, wow, well, this is a co-evolutionary dynamic, which if you go to evolutionary biologists, they're like, oh yeah, there's co-evolution all of the time, right? Like, you can see these co-evolutionary dynamics, with the birds that, take the whatever out of the teeth of the alligator or something, like I'm making a thing up here, but this co-evolutionary dynamic is real. And like this idea that, species are not just like fixed in some form, that they actually interact over time and affect each other on evolutionary timescales, right? And we can see over the human history, we have like done what's called not natural selection, but it's called artificial selection, where we create a certain effect to like create these weird versions of like wheat or corn or dogs or cats, right? that probably would not just like evolve naturally except in relationship with human intention, right? And then there's, if you take that idea and go like, well, have humans domesticated themselves? Like, have we actually constructed essentially an incentive feedback loop through our institutions and our history and our narrative and our language and our laws that has actually had a selection effect back upon us as humans? I think it's true to some degree. I mean, transhumanists talk about, oh, like, is CRISPR, we're going to modify our genome or blah, blah, blah. We're going to become cyborgs. Probably. But you could actually look back for the last 20,000 years and go like, we've actually already been altering and shaping our evolutionary dynamic through this. And my favorite, this guy is hardly known. His name is James Mark Baldwin. He died in 1934, but he's famous for coming up with this thing called the Baldwin effect, which, prior to Darwin, Lamarck had this idea of like Lamarckian evolution. Like, it's sort of like, oh, you use it and then it kind of develops it and you pass it along to your children, right? The Baldwin effect is this clever way of kind of seeing how you can get a Lamarckian-like effect in a Darwinistic way. And it kind of is through this feedback loop over time. Like, hey, if somehow conformity to the social construct helps you reproduce better, well, then you should actually start to see some biases in like maybe personality traits that are more compliant, like to rule of law. Or like, if we take this difference between the emergence of red and the emergence of blue, well, you would expect blue level civilizations to do things like, kill the sociopaths more often, which we kind of do, right? Like they're almost these, we're almost like obsessed with them on like our TV shows, right? Like about like these crazy killers, like a Ted Bundy or something like this. And we try to actually filter them out of the population. Like, so these are kind of extreme examples, but I do think the mechanism of an evolutionary dynamic that is an interaction between the social cultural matrix, the institutions, the technology, and the culture, and our development as individual humans, our psychology, the beliefs that we end up acquiring, and even potentially reflected in our genes given over a long enough period of time, like, is plausible. Like, and that ability to see that itself is an indicator of integral or yellow thought, right? Oh, of course, it's not this way or that way. It sort of emerges.
Well, and this is one of the sort of deep concerns I have. Okay. And part of this is because of I'm biased. Okay. And I think you're right in your critique. For example, if we were to think of yellow, if we think of the spiral as a hierarchy of better, right? Better than, which is wrong. You said it spreads out as a tree, in tree-like fashion or in vascular fashion, based on different aspects or circumstances of time and place around those particular branches, right? It might not look like very much like a spiral at all. The spiral is in the form that we're used to seeing it rendered, looks very hierarchical. So you get all these people who are like, oh, I'm so turquoise. I'm turquoise, off the charts turquoise, right? And they think of themselves as these I don't know, wizards or something, and like intellectual masters. But there's something interesting in that. If we think of it as being able to respond to a certain level of complexity by virtue of cognitive complexity, such that we can appreciate the phenomena that you're describing, or have the ability to stand out, take the meta perspective or the meta perspective. And there's always this real arms race to see who could be more meta among these intellectuals, particularly those who like these kind of frameworks.
Totally.
You know what I mean? And there's something to that because it's like, holy shit, we can think this way. I see you, you see me. I can see that we can both think this way. Let's see who can do it more, right? But as we said before, there are constraints on that. There are cognitive constraints on that. So as you move into second tier type of thinking, into cognitive yellow and cognitive turquoise. It's almost as if we do accept that people move en masse through these developmental stages by virtue of forming sociocultural enclaves that transmit these ways of thinking, we still have to admit that there is going to be cognitive limitations for some people. And to the extent that there is yellow and turquoise cognition, and that higher level cognition confers certain kinds of advantages that are not just survival advantages, but other kinds of advantages, say to take advantage of other people or to win certain prizes or to succeed in life in certain ways. Because the easier way to say it is smart people tend to succeed. That is going to stratify society to a very great degree.
Possibly.
Not just in terms of values, but cognitive stratification is very real. And so the idea that you're going to move the masses of humanity through these psychosocial stages of development and we're all going to be turquoise might not happen for a very long time, if at all, unless you find a way through technology to expand the cognitive capabilities of beings who are essentially more or less the same as they were 100,000 years ago.
Well, my response to this, I think I'm a little less concerned. I do believe that the possibility of cognitive stratification is real, but we have other weird things like the Flynn effect where IQ is kind of strangely increasing over time. Like, why is that happening? We don't really totally know exactly why this is happening.
But that's so, the Flynn effect is so marginal.
Sure. But I'm not going to focus on the Flynn effect. I'm just throwing that out as a thing. Like, and I want to just focus more generally on this idea we talked about way at the beginning. Like, how much surplus plasticity do we have to kind of allocate for things? And it's kind of interesting. Like, we can see these people and like, I don't know if you heard of the Bat Boy who like is blind, but he can click and he has like sonar and he creates like an image of the world around him. Like, well, that's pretty cool. It's like, well, this is sort of interesting because now we have these experiments and explorations in like biofeedback, in like accelerated learning, accelerated education. And, we can, especially if we improve our ability to educate children, we can move them through these things faster. And maybe, the adults of today who are like, they peaked out at or like blue or something like this. I mean, I think of my dad in a lot of ways, like a real healthy blue traditional meme and some amount of orange as an engineer. And that was kind of his station. And he didn't really develop more sophisticated thoughts like along these lines. And he was fine in that way. Like he really succeeded at that particular thing. And maybe that's true but people die. Like there's generational change. People die. And then there's new generations that come along. And like, I'm sort of interested in how much difference these systems are going to make, especially like think about growing up with a smartphone or growing up without not knowing the internet wasn't there. I mean, you and I saw the internet. We didn't have an internet and then we did.
Recall that these are called V memes in the Beck literature, right? Not in the Clare Graves literature, because I think his was at the same time or predates Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, in which the word meme is given to us, right? It is the intellectual or communications equivalent of a gene, right? In the domain of communications and language. So we have memes, which are transmitted viruses of value or information, values, information, whatever, and they either persist through the speaker or the writer or the internet or whatever the hell, or they don't, right? So it's interesting that you perhaps unwittingly came back to this idea that these are all memes. What does the memosphere look like that can bring more and more people? I'm not sure. I think it's, again, I would push back to this as being a learned phenomenon and say that in order to bring more people, if that were even desirable, in order for more people to ascend to second tier, if there's any meaning to in the spatial metaphor of second tier, that you're going to have to mix in social evolution fashion institutions, technology,
Yes.
and culture with our wired biology.
Yeah. I don't disagree with this at all. Like, I think another way of, feeling, I just want to go back and just grant the stratification to some degree is going to be there. And I'm okay with that. Right. The question is like, how do we bring everybody along for the ride rather than kind of like forking into some horrific, like that movie Elysium, or, what was the Time Machine, like with the Morlocks and the whatever, it's like, wait, we don't want to fork that severely over time. So how do we make sure we bring it along? Well, actually, one of the intuitions, and this is, debatable if this is part of what it means to be integral or meta-modern or not, like what comes after postmodernism, postmodern, like there is whatever this momentous leap that Don Beck said, get you to second tier, whatever that is. If I believe in that, one of the parts of it to me is not just this kind of like looking forward transhumanist thing, but it's actually a looking backwards. It's actually kind of a key. It's the include and then transcend, right? The include is look at all this amazing shit that we all have created. Look at all the good parts of these different historical moments. Look at all these parts that are inside of me. There's actually, you got to do a little bit of therapy in a way. You got to like come to grips with like my internal killer that would like kill to protect my baby or something like this. This is a real thing. And some people are like, oh no, I never would. It's like, well, you haven't really fully like integrated that red part of you or magical thinking. Like, are you just like, so, such a cold-hearted rationalist, you can't feel the magic of being alive? Well, maybe you could like, go to South America, do a medicine journey or something. Like this reintegration of these previous parts of the spiral is actually part of that. And like, I think what comes along with that is a respect and a compassion and an honoring of those things, which is part of like what helps bring them along. We don't want to like squash them anymore. We want to foster the healthiest versions of them. Is it intuition?
Well, and it reminds me of in going back into the past and exploring, especially exploring genius in the past and attempting to categorize by virtue of these heuristic schemes, right? So go back and look at the exceptions. I mean, look at the Buddha when the Buddha was operating, and he's completely broke through the caste system, the ultra blue Hinduism of his surroundings, and created an entire movement that was far more advanced and far more egalitarian. Like, what the fuck was that? Right? That's kind of off the charts. Buddha and Buddhism is like off the charts. You could say he's got orange swatches of orange and yellow in him. What about Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas. What about Leibniz? Like, some of these thinkers are just like they're thoroughly embedded in their time and place, but just like there are moments when you read their work and you're just like, holy shit, you're so far ahead of your time and so far out there in terms of the levels of complexity and cognitive processes that you're able to hold in your mind at once. There's no way you could have been born at this. You're an alien, dude, right? Or whomever, not just dudes. Although we do tend to look at men, but there are just so many of these geniuses in the past, like an Emily Dickinson. Where the hell did she come from? She's in puritanical America. She's just scribbling stuff down in her. She's not standing on the shoulders of that many giants. She's reading the Bible all the time. She's surrounded by a bunch of Puritans. But my God, what a genius. Where did she come from? So yeah, these people are are heuristics breakers. Totally. But one final thought, and I know we got to wrap up because we're already over our 2 hours. But I'm reminded of this in just the sort of admonition to people who like to break down models like this. I love spiral dynamics. I love integral theory. I love Enneagram and even simpler things, just like Enneagram and personality tests. I love these. And what I love about them is that they achieve a cognitive sweet spot between high-res hypercomplexity or hyperscience on the one hand, and on the other, something that would be the opposite that gives you too much abstraction, right? It's these cognitive heuristics, these models are a way of appreciating phenomena in an imperfect way that allows you to upgrade your pattern recognition. And in that sense, they're extremely useful tools. We should not jettison them because we think we're better than they are. And we should just find the appropriate uses of them for certain contexts. Yeah. And I think that that's the best way to honor something like a spiral dynamics or developmental theories of this sort.
Yeah. Yeah. By way of final thoughts from my point of view in this conversation is, whether our listeners like developmental models or don't like them, or they liked spiral dynamics or they prefer another one, doesn't really matter all that much. Right? What matters is can you get some intuition that there is a relationship between the development of an individual and the collective, and can you get an intuition that this is not over? It's an ongoing process that continues into the future. And can you get a sense that part of how it emerges is actually through conversations like the ones that we're having? Can we criticize what came before? Can we build off of it? And what does that end up looking like? And, whether you think it's, meta-modern or integral or something else or transhumanism, kind of doesn't really matter. We're here to talk about the fact that we believe that it is going to happen and it is going to come. So with that, Max, I loved being with you today. We really got into a lot of depth. And anything you want to say before we say goodbye?
I think there's so much more of this to explore, and I feel like we'll come back to it, at least some of the branching themes. But thank you so much for doing this with me today, Porch.
Awesome. And please return and join us for another episode about humanity's future and all that good stuff on Social Evolution.